Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to the panelists and to the audience. I am Ibrahim Awad. I'm Professor of Practice of Global Affairs in the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. I'm also the director of its Center for Migration and Refugee Studies, and I have a background in the United Nations system. On behalf of Dean Nabil Fahmy, Dean of GAP, the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and on my own, I would like to welcome you all to the Tahrir Dialogue number 88 on Global Disorder, Asian Perspectives. Today's debate is one of the series of the virtual Tahrir Dialogues that GAP is dedicating to discussing the state of the global order at the beginning of the third decade. Tensions and disputes afflicting several segments of the global order were not unnoticed by actors and observers, be they policymakers, academics, analysts, or the concerned public at large. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a silver lining that should be recognized. It literally thrust into the global public debate the set frictions, tensions, and debates, and more importantly, the approach to be adopted in order to effectively remedy them after 1/5 of the 21st century has elapsed. In this global debate, Asian perspectives are of the utmost importance. In some analysis, Asia's total domestic product is expected to overtake that of the rest of the world combined in the current year 2020. The continent will continue its ascent, and by 2030, Asia should contribute some 60% of global growth. This is nothing strange. Up until the middle of the 18th century, that is less than 300 years ago, the blink of an eye in the history of humankind, Asia's represented 60% of the world product. The second, third, and seventh economies in the world are Asian. Asia is also home to some 60% of the world population. I can go on, but for the sake of time, I would rather let the very distinguished panelists that we are proud to host today put forth their perspectives on the global disorder. I will introduce them briefly, since longer bios faithful to their illustrious careers were attached to the invitations to the dialogue. I will do the introductions in the order of interventions of our panelists, which will start from the location furthest from Cairo and then progress westwards. Our first panelist will be Yoriko Kawaguchi, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, former Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on Foreign Affairs, and currently visiting professor at Musashino University. You're warmly welcome, Yoriko Kawaguchi.
Thank you.
Our second panelist will be Wang Jizi, professor and president of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies at Peking University, honorary president of the Chinese Association of American Studies, who is not alien to GAP. You're most welcome, Wang Jizi. The third panelist is George Yeo, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore, who also held several other ministerial portfolio and is currently the senior advisor to the Koch Group. Most welcome to the Tahrir Dialogue, George Yeo. Our fourth panelist will be Shiv Shankar Menon, former National Security Advisor to India's Prime Minister, former Foreign Secretary, and at present visiting professor at Ashoka University. You are warmly welcome, Shankar Menon. Last but not least, Nabil Fahmy, the founder and current Dean of GAP at AUC, a career diplomat, and the former Foreign Minister of Egypt. Nabil is actually the host of this Tahrir dialogue. The panelists will express their views and engage in a discussion, after which they will react to the questions raised and the comments made by the audience. We have already received many questions. The audience is most welcome to send questions using the chat button at the bottom of your screen. To launch the debate, I will put one question to each of the panelists. It would be highly appreciated if they could kindly reply in 3 to 4 minutes each. My first question is to Yoriko Kawaguchi. The pandemic has elicited a great deal of discussion. Some observers pointed out the disorderly way in which the pandemic was dealt with in countries of all regions. Even if comparable lockdowns, protective measures, and economic stimulus policies were resorted to, international cooperation was largely absent. The opposite of cooperation being conflict, from a Japanese perspective, where do you think the world is on the continuum between cooperation and conflict? What should be done to reinforce cooperation, which is a major tool of Japanese foreign policy?
Thank you, Ibrahim. Let me first thank you for the invitation to participate in this prestigious dialogue. I also would like to say hello to my old friends who are on the panel. It's nice to see you again, even though remotely. Certainly, we are in the most difficult crisis in recent history, maybe since 1929 or so. We have about 6.3 cases as of today, and 370,000 people lost their lives, unfortunately. The epicenter of the crisis, of the contagion, has now moved to the developing and emerging nations. Certainly, uncertainties prevail. We don't know how long the COVID-19 will haunt us. We don't know how, to what extent our economies will deteriorate. We do not know to what extent our social unrest will spread and deepen. So we don't really know much about the disease at the moment. The COVID-19 has certainly invited many discussions. It has invited criticisms and tensions among nations. I think it is important to realize that international order has been in trouble for some time before the crisis. So the COVID-19 really start the tensions that we have now, but it did exacerbate the difficulties that we have already. This is used as an opportunity to satisfy one's domestic needs. It is also used to pursue some countries' national interests. These are used to aggravate the situation. Unfortunately, we do not have a major international cooperation. The virus crosses the national border. So by definition, we have to deal with it nationally, crossing the border, but major international cooperation to deal with that is not really there. So this is very unfortunate. It widened the schism between the nations. So the answer to the first part of your question, Ibrahim, is that we are on the conflict cooperation axis. We have moved to the difficult direction, unfortunately. So the next question we have to ask is how far we might go. To this, I have two good hopes that we have to bear on our mind. One is that interdependence. Ibrahim, you talked about the economic growth of Asia contributing to the world. And it is true, we have contributed and we will continue to do so. The major part of that is interdependence of countries, economic and other interdependence, which was brought about by globalization. Even taking the US and China as an example, they are interdependent. So it will be very difficult for them to decouple completely for more than a short period of time. So the good news is that economic reality is that the whole nations, the whole world is interdependent to each other. This is the great difference between the Cold War days and today. The second element, good sign, is that the increased strength of non-government entities. We tend to think of international order in terms of government-to-government relationship. This is not the case anymore, especially with the progress in technology, in IT technologies. For example, despite tensions at the government level, information on the virus structure or the way to treat the patients have been freely available on medical journals. This is one example. So the good news is that cooperation has spread from one level, government to government level, to other levels, company to business, individual to individual, academia to academia, local governments and to local governments. So it's very thick. We have many layers of cooperation. So in this context, what is interesting is what WTO has announced. It announced that it will it will create basically a foundation to strengthen their funding base. And I understand that they were discussing this even before the COVID-19 crisis, but it just was announced at this time. So something like that is very suggestive. So these are the two good signs that we have in thinking of how far we might go on this axis. Now, the last question you asked is how we could strengthen our cooperation. We know, looking at our past history, that cooperation has been most effective when the leading countries really lead and contribute the financial aspect, the in finance and also in personnel. In the past, the US has played this role. Now, relatively speaking, the US is getting weaker. So the question is, who else? The good cooperation is there when the leaders cooperate with each other. The leaders are responsible and cooperate with each other. Now, unfortunately, China and the US, two largest economies on earth, are not on good terms. So I don't think we can really expect any major international scale cooperation to be successful. But we have to also remind ourselves that there are cooperation taking place actually. Some private companies, the Jack Ma of China, for example, sent the assistance to other countries. For example, G20 had a meeting in March, and they talked about cooperation, and they came up with a statement, although G7 could not quite produce the statement. So we do have cooperation, but if we talk about international cooperation on a major scale, which we need actually at this time, without the two leaders being friendly to each other, it is a bit difficult. And this suggests a major problem, I think, more fundamental problem. Maybe I'm talking too long, but just one last comment that I want to make is that this is a fundamental problem. When the US is weaker to lead single-handedly, and if other countries are not ready to follow, what will happen to the international order and international governance framework? So that is the major issue that we have to really look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuriko. Thank you so much. We will come back to some of the very important statements that you have just made. But for the moment, let me put my question to Wang Jizi. And in fact, it relates to some of what Yuriko has said. In the international system, some parties, especially the United States, have faulted China for the spread of coronavirus. For a number of parties, the pandemic has revealed the extent to which countries at different development levels dangerously depended on Chinese manufacturing. In contrast, others emphasized the efficiency with which China brought the disease under control, its assistance to countries hit by the pandemic, and its international cooperation in scientific research on the virus. So from China, what is your analysis of this contrasting discussion?
Thank you very much, Abraham. And I just found out that I'm among the panelists, I'm the only one who has had no political experience. So I doubt my quality of presentation. But anyway, I will have to say something, not on behalf of China, but on behalf of myself. I think China's performance in fighting COVID-19 pandemic has been somewhat controversial in the United States or in the West at large. The Trump administration originally praised China's contribution to fighting the disease and saying good things about our leader Xi Jinping, and they said they appreciated China's transparency and provision of medical supplies to America. But when coronavirus spread out in the United States, all of a sudden they changed their attitude And they blamed China, saying, well, China did not have enough transparency, and then China did not inform the world early enough to prevent that from happening to the other part of the world. So there's still the controversy between China and the United States as to the originality of the disease. China insists that we dealt with the issue originally, but of course it happened in Wuhan, but they could have happened somewhere else, maybe in Italy, maybe in the United States, and some people still strongly believe that last October, when there was the global, international military sport game, the United States brought with some diseases to China. Now, of course, that is a conspiracy theory, but as our Japanese friend just said, there was a blame game. And now I could add later on about the relationship between China and the United States, but the pandemic began when Washington had already decided to decouple with China in trade, investment, and technological engagement. The claim that the United States depended, now they claim that the United States depended too much on China for ventilators, face masks, and the medicine, and will increase its own manufacturers of those things. So the pandemic actually accelerated US efforts to decouple with China. And now I think things are not turning out very nicely between the United States and China after the trade war. And then actually China and the United States signed the phase 1 of the trade deal last January, but it depends on the two countries as to whether they will carry out the phase 1 trade deal. And the United States also threatens to withdraw its manufacturing capacity from China. And the US government crashed down on Chinese companies listed in the United States. So there are many things happening between the two countries after the outbreak of the pandemic. As to the second part of your comment, that is actually, some others emphasized that the efficiency with which China brought the disease under control, its assistance to countries that hit by the pandemic, and its international cooperation in scientific research on the virus. Yes, I think China has done a great deal. But some people say, well, we helped only those countries who are friendly to China. That is not the case, but of course, I don't have the diplomatic experiences, but I will say, well, other countries do the same. When there is a crisis, when some other countries need help, you help those countries which were most friendly to you. So China helped Pakistan, China helped Cambodia, China helped Italy, and that country is the first European major country to agree with China on the Belt and Road Initiative. But also China has made contributions to a lot of things. One big thing happening is China's attitude and the different attitudes toward WHO. I think that the United States denounced WHO and cut down its financial assistance to WHO, whereas China increased its financial assistance to WHO, and China has said that it is in favor of WHO leadership in the world. And China's diplomacy since the outbreak of the pandemic has been very, very active and somewhat successful. When I'm in China watching TV every day, literally the Chinese leader Xi Jinping had phone calls with almost every single world leader in the past few months. including U.S. President Donald Trump. In comparison, I would say, well, the United States is in deep trouble. Not only the pandemic, but also its riot at home, its diplomatic crisis with not only China, but some other countries. So I would like to hear your comments on the United States. But I think I'm not exaggerating the fact that, this is the moment China has more confidence. China has more, if you hear the Chinese media, they are full of self-righteousness and triumphalism. Some of them are not valid, but this is the case. Last thing I would say is China, of course, China has recovered from the pandemic very successfully, but in my case, at Peking University, the university is still locked down. On the street, on the university campus where you visited, there are very few people walking, and there is still the nervousness on part of the most Chinese. For instance, when I walk around the campus alone, seeing very few people, when people look at me, they say, "Professor Wang, you are not wearing a mask. What's happening to you?" So, so this is still the kind of uneasiness among Chinese, and most universities and most schools are in Beijing, at least, still locked down. And so we are still trying to recover from the situation, and we need international cooperation, and we need more understanding from the world. So I will stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for this contribution. And again, we'll come back in the discussion to what you have just said. My third question goes to George Yeo. George, in facing up to the pandemic, global supply chains have been put into question. Calls have emerged to revisit globalization, which amount to questioning an essential segment of the international order that the world has known in the last 25 years. Singapore, a small, highly achieving emerging economy, has benefited a great deal from globalization. So from your perspective, from Singapore, what do you think about these calls to revisit globalization, and what is the importance for Singapore of agreed norms and rules in the international system generally?
Thank you, Ibrahim, for having me on this forum. Thank you, Nabil, for inviting me. This pandemic is a huge shock to human society. And I'm constantly reminded of the asteroid which hit Earth a long time ago, which created tremendous challenge to all living species. Some went extinct, others thrived, and the future changed. In the same way, this pandemic, and here I agree with both Yoriko and Jisi, this pandemic has accelerated trends and deepened divisions. And there is a kind of a Darwinian response. There are some institutions which are weak, they will collapse. There are some institutions which are strong, they stand firm, and they'll become more important in the future. And different societies are responding differently to the pandemic. And the outcome will be very different when all this is over. We're not sure how long this pandemic will hover over humanity. If it burns out in the next few months, then to some extent, no great damage is done. But if this pandemic hovers over humanity for a few years, weakening, then strengthening, then weakening, then coming back, the impact on human society, on social institutions, will be very great. And we know that it's accentuated the bad relations between China and the US. It has accentuated social divisions within the US. And indeed, in all societies, most economies in the world today are being kept going by subsidies. And you can't continue this indefinitely. And the US can continue longer because it prints the US dollar. But for those of us who've got to balance our books, this is very expensive. And unless we're able to recover the economy, inevitably, there will be great social stresses. And if this thing continues for long, we'll see social upheavals, not just in the US, but in many countries. So international institutions like the WTO, like the WHO, also come under stress because they grew to address the problems of a previous era. But now with this pandemic, we're entering a new era, and global institutions which cannot adapt to a new set of circumstances will become dysfunctional. We don't know. I mean, if Biden wins, then maybe the damage to international institutions will not be that great. We don't know, but some damage is permanent and irrecoverable. What is most dramatic is we are seeing in the world today a differential response to the pandemic. China's incredible response before Chinese New Year, which shocked the world and which the WHO described as being unprecedented in history, reversed a situation which would otherwise have been devastating for China. So China suffered, of all the major economies, China suffered the least damage and is the first to recover. And it's a V-shaped recovery. I was talking to a Hong Kong economist who watches China very carefully yesterday. He said, even though World Bank IMF talks about China growing by 1-2% this year, he thinks China could grow by 4% this year. Now, Li Keqiang has been very careful. He didn't want to make any predictions during the NPC. But China is back in business. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, I think Singapore in a matter of weeks, have all now a response to COVID, which is based on suppression. In other words, we do not know when it will go away. We can't put all our hopes on the vaccine because vaccines are dangerous and it will take years before vaccines become universally available. But you must have a system to suppress it. So if it becomes a cluster, you contain it, you put it down, and then you watch for other clusters. So you need a system of surveillance, a system of contact tracing, of treatment, a response. So you're going to find in the coming years, almost 2 regions in the world, one in East Asia, where there's low COVID, and which will increasingly facilitate travel internally between China and Japan and Korea and Macau and Taiwan and Singapore and Hong Kong and maybe Australia and New Zealand, and other parts of the world which do not have the ability to keep COVID at a low level and which cannot recover their economies because the problem is still there, causing fear, impeding production. And mind you, in such a world, the social stresses become political stresses. And we're entering a dangerous period in history if we're not careful. Therefore, the importance of supporting international institutions. We talk about supply chains. Supply chains cannot be turned back overnight. It will have to be recovered trade lane by trade lane, because of all the fears of a rebound. International shipping today is perhaps half of what it was before COVID, because when ships sail, there are different quarantine procedures at different ports. So scheduled sailing has become very difficult. Many passenger airlines are not flying, so the belly loads are empty. air freighters have become very scarce, and the cost of air freight has gone up maybe 5-6 times. The Eurasian railways has become very important because they are robust to COVID. So train and road traffic from China to Europe through Kazakhstan and Russia are at an all-time high. So these are new patterns. And we have to work together and open up green lanes one by one. I was very happy when Li Keqiang in MPC said, China will move to conclude the RCEP, which is a free trade area, including Japan, Korea, all of ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, and China. China is fully committed to the free trade agreement between China, Japan, and Korea. And for the first time, he said, China takes a positive attitude towards the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. Now, the US wanted the TPP to be a grouping against China, but Trump pulled the US out of it. Now China wants to join. And I think all of us should encourage China to join, because this will put pressure on the US to come back and support regionalism and international cooperation. So when you ask me about Singapore, Singapore has to accept the world for what it is. If it's a decoupled world, we work with the decoupled world. If it's a localized world, we work with it. We know that the world of the past will never come back. It will be globalization with substantial localization and regionalization. So we're in a very dramatic new period of history. I think for those in the Middle East, I have no doubts in my mind that East Asia will become much more important to you in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joe. This is very, very useful. It will be very useful in the discussion. Thank you so much. My next question is to Shankar Menon. On the occasion of the pandemic, calls have emerged to reconsider globalization, in particular excessive delocalization made possible by trade liberalization. India already had reservations on the actual implementation of some aspects of trade liberalization, such as in trade in services, and not only in services. India also has reservations on the functioning of other segments of the international system. From an Indian perspective, do you consider that some reordering of the international system is required? And if it is, in which direction?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. From an Indian point of view, actually, we were among one of the major beneficiaries of the globalization decades. I mean, in the 10 years from 2000 to 2011, we actually pulled 140 million people out of poverty. And the Indian economy was actually much more integrated into the world by 2014. Something like 49.6% of our GDP was external merchandise trade, just merchandise trade, not counting the rest of the external sector. That's declined since, for obvious reasons. So I don't think India had objections to globalization. In fact, India's problem was that globalization was limited in some ways. It was primarily a globalization for goods, for capital, but not so much for people or for ideas. But what we've seen since the pandemic, at least, is that there were already several forces trying to deglobalize. There were, some of the, the initiators of globalization were no longer convinced it worked for them. We saw that happening in the US. We saw it happening in the West. And those have gained more strength. And that, for me, and for India actually, is part of the problem. There was already a fragmentation of the world economy going on, a regionalization. And it already looked before the pandemic as though we were heading for three large blocs, the North American, NAFTA by whatever name, the EU and the RCP, TPP, an Asian bloc center. Last year, for the first time, Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia traded more with China than they did with the US. And if the pandemic makes China-US relations more contentious, then clearly what you're seeing is an acceleration of that trend towards regionalization, towards localization, towards the breaking up of the globalized economy that we got used to and did well out of. In India itself, globalization had several consequences, including accentuating inequality and threats to identity, which we've seen in several societies. And there is a big debate in India. And you've seen some of the effects. India pulled out of the RCP discussions, raised tariffs for the last 3 years. And there is a fundamental discussion. But frankly, given India's position, there is no way that India can transform herself, develop, without engaging with the world or being part of the globalized world. Don't forget, people have been trying to deglobalize since the financial crisis in 2008. And yet the virus proves that we're still a global world. And we need to work with each other. So do we need to reorder the international system? Of course we must, because the pandemic, as everyone has said so far, has created a new situation. And at the very least, we need to put human security much higher in our priorities for every government. The problem, to my mind, I wish I were as hopeful as George is. My problem is that I actually see all governments struggling. They're all in survival mode because the uncertainty has grown so much, and none of them is absolutely sure that they know what they're doing or where they will be 6 months from now, 1 year from now. And in that situation, frankly, their responses to the pandemic, to the crisis, even to the economic crisis, are political responses. They're not economic responses. And what we're seeing is an accentuation of social divisions, actually a tearing up of the social contract in several parts of the world. And the longer the crisis goes, and here I agree entirely with George, the longer it goes on, the more the stress that it will induce. So what should we do? For me, the scope of the crisis actually gives us a huge opportunity. Tinkering with the multilateral system as we know it is not enough, clearly. I mean, we've seen the G20 response to the pandemic is so weak compared to what they did when the financial crisis happened and their response in London in April 2009. The G7 couldn't even come up with a statement. UN Security Council, some bromides. And already WHO is controversial, different people have different views. I don't think it's just tinkering or reform is enough. We have an opportunity today where we see that the system is broken to actually build a new system together. And the uncertainty should force us to be reasonable. That, for me, would be the best possible outcome. Because all our issues, whether pandemics, climate change, maritime security, international terrorism, cyber security and governance, you name it, they all require international cooperation. And unless we do that, frankly, I see a very, very bright future. I don't think that there can be a prosperous, peaceful, healthy little island anywhere on this globe anymore. Those days are over. And I think we have to therefore think in terms of radical solutions. And if we don't do it, we will, as I've said elsewhere, be in a poorer, meaner, smaller world. But we do have this opportunity to build something big because of the sheer scale of the crisis. And I hope it frightens our leaders into doing that. In South Asia, for instance, it did get our leaders to start discussing cooperation among ourselves. Sub-regional cooperation has been at a low ebb for the last 3 or 4 years, but finally they've actually got together, shocked by the crisis, forced by the crisis to actually start working together. But I would like to see that happen on a much bigger scale. I'll stop here because I'm sure there's other views and questions.
Thank you very much. You have said a great deal. You have said a great deal. So thank you so much, and we'll be back to your statements in a few minutes. Nabil Fahmy, Southeast, and East Asia have been gaining in economic and political weight in the international system in the past several decades. And this rise has been followed with admiration in West Asia, to which a part of Egypt belongs, as well as other Arab countries. So what is your analysis of the central positions which these Asian subregions have come to occupy in the international system, and which functions and roles do you think they can perform and play in order to bring about fairer international order that responds to the challenges of the third decade and the coming decades of the 21st century? Unmute, Nabil, unmute.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking all the distinguished panelists for joining us today, reaffirming what you said at the beginning. I think their first statements are testimony to the depth of their thinking and the insightfulness, which has always been a reason, besides my personal friendship with all of them, it's always been a reason to really enjoy discussions and learn from all of them. The second reason I'm very happy to have them is a point you just mentioned now. We have tended to look in the region in discussions about the New World Order. We've tended to look westward alone, while I actually believe it's important to look globally, which is the name of the school that I'm the dean of. But over and above that, I also believe, and it was said just a few minutes ago, I actually think there will be more common interests and engagement, be they economic, social, or personal. And I would even add to that in a soft security sense, in terms of security as well, between West Asia, where I come from, and the rest of Asia. So listening to Asian perspectives, and I underline with a plural, is important, because that's volume-wise, it's important, but also it's one of the success stories about Asia. And what I mean here is they've had their differences, but grosso modo, particularly in comparison to other parts of the world, they've been able to manage their differences and work together on many counts at the same time. And I don't only mean this by way of the nation-state issue, but also in terms of the complexity and diversity of their ethnicity and these kinds of issues. So dealing with each other, dealing with different stakeholders, is, if I may, and I apologize if this is not the wrong term, a positive Asian trait we need all to learn from. And I would also add here, before answering your question directly, that I agree with the comment made that the international order was already being challenged even before the coronavirus, the new coronavirus. It's been accentuated by the challenges that, because they're unique, we don't have an answer to them yet. And because we don't have an answer to them yet, we need to engage with each other, because one thing that is obvious, this kind of problem will not stop at a border. And unless we find ways to cooperate with each other, we will ultimately be deterring ourselves. Let me simply make one reference, and then I will answer your question. This reminds me, frankly, of the UN. The UN, when it was first started, was a couple of dozen countries. Now we're looking at 192, if I'm not mistaken, could be more than that. And the founders of the UN, post-World War II, are the ones complaining the most about how complex the UN is, and occasionally that it is inefficient. Well, it's more complex because the world is more complex, because you have to be more democratic about how you deal with the world, and because you need to engage in world order, response to the collective interests a balance of interests of these different countries, while at the same time respecting leadership and respecting the interests of the major, more powerful, richer countries. I would add also that I think one of the main problems of the present world order is that it has lost its social conscience over the years. It's become material to a fault. And I mean material to a fault not only in the economic sense, because that can be a positive, but it is to a fault, but also in terms of the security sense. Everything is looked at in terms of power politics, power in the larger term of the word, while we need to look at not only the tactical engagement of power politics, but the strategic engagement of social engagement. The points you raised, as I said, for somebody in West Asia, and regrettably, our extension into Asia has been the battleground of many conflicts. So first conclusion I draw is that they've been able to live with each other, be able to agree or disagree, but at the same time reduce the number of military tensions and use of force to a great degree. That's a lesson we need all to learn from. I would encourage them, because they've been able to do this within their countries and occasionally across borders as well. I would encourage them to be the main proponents of a new multilateralism, a multilateralism that includes us all, not only in terms of benefits, but also in terms of responsibility. I would encourage them, given the depth of their societal engagement, to be very proactive in projecting principles of a new world order. And let me reiterate a suggestion that I mentioned, that I did a while ago. I actually think that, be it under the auspices of the Secretary General of the UN or any other auspices, if that's possible, I recommend very highly that a number of preeminent thinkers engage each other on trying to develop the principles and parameters of a new world order outside of the government circles, so that it's more strategic than tactical, because tactical politics is always at the expense of strategic politics. I think that's important. And I also think it's important that we not only call on others to take leadership, but that leaders within our own societies take leadership. We're facing new realities. I mean, I live in a country that's, depending on who you talk to, it's 6,000 or 7,000 years in history. And I can tell you, and I'm very proud to be an Egyptian, I can tell you that the coronavirus has raised questions in society that are really disconcerting. People are worried. They don't have let me just close with a quick amusing point. In my past functions in negotiating conflict resolution, one of my interlocutors once told me, the problem with you Egyptians is that you've been around so long, you don't have a worst case scenario paranoid. I will always be there, you'll be there tomorrow. That's actually true. But the reality is the challenges we face aren't any longer simply those around our border, aren't any longer the day-to-day challenges. They're much larger context. And I would like to see my Asian colleagues, as well as others, by the way, really embrace multilateral, if you want, a neo-multilateralism where it really includes governments, non-governmental entities, and stakeholders in what is truly a collective order consistent with the UN Charter today, but one that develops it because it's becoming very static. Thank you, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Nabil, and thank you all for these very substantive contributions. I will merge the questions that arise out of your interventions with those that I have received from the audience, because they relate to what you have just said. So my first question would be to Yoriko. You have listened to George and to Shankar, and now, in fact, to Nabil, talking about the multilateral system that is not any longer adapted to the present day issues. Shankar has called for a reconstruction of this, not only for reform, but even to reconstruct the system. But Shankar and George also talked about social contract, that social conflict that may arise within countries. So how do you imagine a multilateral system that is not only international, that can also take account of what would happen at the national level of countries? Because obviously what happens socially in one country cannot be completely divorced and could be contained in one country. How do you imagine this new order? In a couple of minutes, please, so that we can listen to all the colleagues.
Thank you. Each country has different social environment and social different problems, and each has a way to deal with it differently. I wholeheartedly agree with the previous speakers on the need to reform the present international order, make it truly multinational, multilateral. And yet, I think it is difficult. It should start from the area which have common interface with each other, such as economy or political matters. But social situation is something probably more domestic, more individualistic than other things such as economy. So we need to reform the international order. We make it, we change it if we could agree to change it. But I think each society at the present time is influenced enough by other countries because we have the technology which tells others real time about what is happening in another country. But I don't think we should include initially at least, the social differences, I mean, the social structure taken into account to this reformed multilateral system.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this acceleration of your thoughts. And let me ask Wang Jizi about an idea that Nabil Fahmy has expressed. Nabil Fahmy has called for a group of intellectuals to work to imagine a new international order or a new global order. What can universities do? What can academics do in China, but the world over? Because academics also talk to each other. They belong to their countries, but they also belong to their disciplines. So what do you think? How do you imagine the effort that could be brought into this discussion by Chinese academia and by academia in general, by the collective thought, global thought in general.
Thank you. As an academic, I think I can make a distinction between the world order and international order. But we in China would prefer the term international order because we have the, a system that consists of nation states or countries. And then the global order and world order will have some other actors, non-state actors and the NGOs and other things. So first of all, I think China is emphasizing the importance of international order based on the United Nations, Charter of the United Nations, and other international law principles, and what we call the democratization of international relations. That is, most people in China say, well, the developing countries are the majority in the world. The developed countries are few, but I personally don't mostly agree with that kind of distinction. So my academic view is that the world is one world. It's not simply a world divided into developing countries and developed countries. For instance, is Singapore a developing country or developed country? You have a better judgment of what you are, but that it could be called a developing country in Asia, but Singapore is a rich country. For instance, the identity of India, I'm somewhat worried that the United States is trying to get India into in the orbit or something, because the latest news is that India may be invited into G7. Washington is trying to enlarge G7 to include India and Australia and South Korea, to say they are democratic countries. China is an authoritarian regime, so China should be isolated. I don't like that isolation. I think China should be part of the world, of the global order and the international order. So we should do a lot to contribute to the international order rather than to divide the world into two camps or two groupings. This is my ideal. But so in China, we have intellectual debates as to whether we should, what kind of relationship we should have with the United States. Some people say we should denounce, United States, this one, that in this way, that one, that way. And I'm not very satisfied with the United States, but I think we should be nice to every country in the world to strengthen the international order, to include the United States, ourselves, and Japan and other countries into this global order. One thing I would want to add is about Asia. As George just said, RCEP has been strengthened, and I'm glad to declare that in the recent months there is better sign of cooperation between Japan, China, and South Korea. So the free trade agreement, it is still far away from the scene, but there are good signs that countries in East Asia can get together and talk about things. One big issue is maybe I was asked Shenkar to answer, that is India's identity as an Asian country, because Chinese are very much worried about the American idea of Indo-Pacific. Yes, I like India, but I would like to see what India's identity is between the United States and China.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this rich contribution. And let me turn to George. You are in the light of what has been said. You have emphasized multilateralism and the need to to reconsider multilateralism. And we have heard several references to East and Southeast Asia recovering quicker than other regions in the world. We have just heard that China, Japan, South Korea are cooperating together well. So what do you think? Do you think that the way forward is through regionalization? Do we want to regionalize trade and integration of economies, or do we want to keep the liberalization and globalization at the global level, if this can be said? Global and region, how do you think the world may be reconstructed in the future?
The driving dynamic is how the US responds to a growing China. It has become an obsession in the US establishment, including the defense and intelligence establishment. And you would have thought that with COVID, there's reason for cooperation. And I was surprised that last week, when Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, gave his press conference, he said China supplied 12 billion masks to the US, 12 billion masks to the US, 40 masks for every man, woman, and child. That statistic, which to me was very interesting, was of course not reported at all in the Western media. Why? Because it goes against a view that China is a problem, and how can the problem be part of our solution? So ignore it. The US now wants all of us to take sides with the US against China. Egypt, Israel, UAE, India, Singapore, join me against China. It's difficult for us to be against China if China is our number one and number two trading partner. And I tell the Americans, if you force a choice on us, you may not like to hear the answer. Why do you want to force a choice on us? China doesn't force a choice on us to choose between them and the US. Why do you want to force a choice on us? The reason is because for a long time, it was a G2 world, a titanic struggle between the US and the Soviet Union, where the US vanquished the Soviet Union and you had a G1 world. And now they say, oh, there's another G2 world coming up with China as the other side. But China has zero interest in the G2 world. China much prefers a multipolar world. For China, that is the best world that they can have. And frankly, I think all of us prefer a multipolar world. And we should, by our responses to American pressure, by our dialogue with America, try and convince them that a multipolar world, though messier, is a more comfortable world for all of us. Now, without some sense of the future, global institutions cannot be reconstructed because the endpoints are different. The Americans want global structures which respond to them as a leader. And if it doesn't respond to them as a leader, they say, well, in that case, I will have nothing to do with it. The day America accepts that this will inevitably become a multipolar world, then we can build structures again. But they will not be the structures of the Bretton Woods, which are ultimately controlled by the US and Europe. The power will have to be shared. And that requires trust to be built up layer by layer. You know, you look at the response to COVID. I was following with some great interest India's response to COVID. And in India, there's no one policy. In the end, India has got a multiplicity of policies because every state, every city responds on its own. Migrant workers are going home. They have to walk hundreds of miles. People come around and give them food, give them money, help them along, cheer them on. You know, human society responds in ways that people on top do not see. We're all human beings in the end. People have feelings for one another. And in their own way, they will do what is right and proper because they have a conscience. So I don't see the future being built in one grand design. I like to say the old cathedral is collapsing. The solution is not a new cathedral. The solution is more like a Middle Eastern souk. I mean, we have structures which are existing, which are operating, and we link up to one another, and then we build shelters, we build meeting places, and gradually, organically, let it grow again to a multipolar reality.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I wish our discussion was longer, in fact, because there are so many issues that you have raised. Shankar, you have, I think the question to you is there, and I don't need to really raise it. This choice that the United States want to impose on others. GC talked about India between China and the United States. What do you think of this discussion? Do we need to choose? How not to choose? And what Georgia just said about the plural structures, not one construction, but a plurality of smaller structures that one day may come together. What do you think about this?
I want to live in Georgia's world. That's where I would rather be. And I don't think, no, that is, from an Indian point of view, it makes no sense having to choose. Just at the basic level, China is our biggest trading partner in goods. To add services, it's the US. I mean, how do we choose between these two? This doesn't work. China's a neighbor. We have civilizational, historical, all sorts of links with China. We share a periphery. We have interests together in the global system. We've worked together. There is no way that we can choose one or the other. In any case, I'm not sure the world is going to be divided that way. China and the US need each other as well. They are economically codependent. And I think the price of decoupling for both is relatively high. So I'm not sure that that's where we will end up if we are rational. But this is what worries me. Because today, the kind of ultranationalism that I see, which is being stoked for reasons of legitimacy by regimes which feel threatened. I mean, when do people shout? When do people raise their voice? When they feel threatened or insecure and they don't know what's happening. And that's exactly what we're seeing in global politics. We're seeing every interstate conflict, every argument today sharpened, heightened, much louder than ever before. And that therefore worries me. We have a series of leaders across the world who are new authoritarians, who base their legitimacy on this ultranationalism. And therefore, I agree with George to look to the leaders, to look to the major state structures in the world to reconstruct this world as it should be, I think would not be very sensible. I think the way to build this, to restructure the world, is really from the bottom up. But we have to agree a certain set of basic ideas, that it'll be an open world, that it is one world, as Wanji said, that it has to be plural. It has to allow for the various kinds of social contracts that each of us makes in our own societies that Yuriko mentioned. It has to be a world where there is actually disaggregated decision-making. Now, you might say, oh, I'm describing India, because India functions like this. Parts of India work very well. I mean, Kerala handled COVID excellently, but through social mobilization. There are other parts which have handled it terribly. But ultimately, you know, it seems to me that we need to look at a world of multiverses before it becomes multipolar. And it's not like there are going to be single poles or 3 or 4 poles which will decide everything. It's going to be a long, messy process. For me, the pandemic has really postponed the emergence of a new order. We were already between orders, and we didn't know where we were going, whether international order, world order, or whatever you want to call it, but we were between orders. And the pandemic has really pushed that forward. And we are going to be in this state of uncertainty for a much longer time than we would have been otherwise. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Nabil, I know that you have always also been against choice, against the question of choice. What do you think of this discussion about bipolar or multipolar world and the necessity of accepting that the world is multipolar before engaging in ideas to reconstruct it in whichever way this is done? So what do you think of multipolar versus bipolar as a foundation for the new order? And then what do you think about choice between China and the United States?
Oh, I'm glad that you explained what you meant by choice, because I was about to say that I'm always supportive of choice as long as you agree with me. But anyway, you're right. I frankly, like many of the panelists today, find the idea that we have to choose between China and the US or between any big country and the other rather ridiculous and inconsistent with the reality that exists today. And I won't take you back to some examples that I practiced when I was in government. More importantly, I just actually don't think that we can make that choice any longer. We have to find ways to make all of these relationships function without them being aggravating factors or friction. And I think leaders, the big countries, need to, and I say this respectfully, they need to grow up and be realistic. Do you actually think your economy can grow the way it did without taking advantage of everybody else around the world? And smaller countries need to understand also that they gained from globalization to a great degree as well, even if we couldn't compete at every level with those larger countries. So let me put it this way. We all benefit from globalization, but we will all pay a price from it not accommodating a larger number of stakeholders. As much as I have been trained to deal with a world order in terms of nation states, well, my training is history. The system today has gone beyond my training. That's probably why I'm getting older. But the reality is, countries take into account big business. Countries take into account tweets. Countries take into account social networks, and they didn't in the past. It is a different paradigm, and unless we realize we have to develop. And I completely agree with the comments made by all of my panelist colleagues. This is going to be gradual. It's not, when I suggested having an expert group, it's not that they can sit down and develop a system and it could be applied tomorrow. That's silly. It's more that, what are the sense of principles do we need to take into account? I'll give you an example. One of the challenges of globalization and the challenges of COVID-19, if you look at markets, we will have to today revisit the issue of resiliency at the expense of the issue of efficiency or profit. In other words, how much of our work should be done local, even if it's more expensive, and how much can it be done beyond our borders at cheaper and more profitable, at the risk of, if you have a COVID-19 crisis, the supply chain may be cut, and so on and so forth. And that's the same thing applies, frankly, in governance. How can you assert authority if you can't physically move from one area to the other? So all of these things come up. I don't really believe in a bipolar world. It didn't exist for a long time. Even a unipolar world is only existing if you think the way the post-World War II system existed. But if you look at the elements affecting the authority of the major powers or the medium powers or the small powers, you're going to see there are so many different elements that it's not the nation-state system saying yes or saying no. I would like to argue again, this is a time for quote unquote leaders around the world, be they nation states or otherwise, to engage in guiding the world, our constituencies and the world creatively, because we're facing new challenges, but at the same time having the wisdom to take into account the interests of different constituencies. I say this because it's very normal, whether it's because of nationalism or because of COVID-19 or both together, that we will always err on the side of caution, on the side of tactics, deal with the immediate concerns first. That's normal. But if you do that at the expense of long-term interests and concerns, you end up killing the beast that you really want to feed in the long term. So I believe this challenge has been very difficult. I believe the only logical conclusion one can draw is we need to find better ways to deal with each other more efficiently on the basis, once again, of the principle of a balance of interest rather than a balance of power.
Thank you very much, Nabil. We are left with 7 minutes, so I will put the same question to the panelists for them to try to reply in a minute or a minute and a half, and I will merge two questions that I have received. What do you think your country can do for global economic recovery? And what is, to you, the role your country can play in reconfiguring the international or the global order? So I will start with Yuriko for a minute or a minute and a half, please.
Okay. We need to increase our assistance in terms of money, in terms of technology, and also we should make business move freely, so that will bring benefits to the countries or to the peoples where they go. And your second question is what we can do to create a new order. I think I agree with the previous speakers on the idea of bottom-up, and also having the individuals talk about it. Maybe some wise men talking about it, wise men and women, I'm sorry. So that is something that perhaps we could do also. We have really initiated many cooperative efforts in the past, so we will keep doing what we have been doing.
Thank you so much. Jizi, what's your reaction to this question?
Yes, simple. I think China is already making great progress in the economic recovery. And in doing so, we still want to not only maintain, but also expand our international cooperation. We continue to export and import, and we are part of the economic globalization. There's no doubt about it. But the second question is more important to me. That is, what kind of order do we want, and how do we contribute to a great global order? I think the first priority, in my perspective, is to stabilize our relationship with the United States. As Shankar just said, China and the United States depend on each other for economic growth, for a lot of things. So I just published an article yesterday saying that we should have 3 bottom lines in US-China relations. First, we don't want to fight a war. The two sides will declare they don't want to fight a war. Second, we should maintain economic cooperation, despite some people saying the decoupling between the two sides. But we have to, on the Chinese side, we have to buy soybeans, we have to buy Boeing aircraft, and so on and so forth. And the United States also needs us. And the third bottom line is we have to maintain humanitarian exchanges. Our students want to go to the United States. American students want to come to my university. We should not stop them from getting together. So despite all the problems created by the United States, I think China should be determined to maintain this order and also maintain the minimum, at least the minimum cooperation with the United States.
Thank you so much. George, your reactions?
I share Qisu's hope, but I fear that in the coming years, the bad relations between the US and China will get worse, principally because of US insecurity about China. In the run-up to the presidential elections, both sides will be competing to outdo each other in being anti-China. What they will actually do after the elections, we'll have to see. I know that China is trying very hard not to escalate, but without being weak. Some decoupling is inevitable. Provided there's no war and things do not get too bad, Southeast Asia will be a beneficiary. Because American companies, some of them will want to decouple from the US because China is a bigger market for them. For many Chinese companies, they may want to decouple from China because the US is a big market for them. And Japanese, Korean, Indian, other companies may prefer Southeast Asia, which have links to everybody. So Singapore's strategy is really just to make a living. And we make our living best if we have a Southeast Asia which is integrated, which is neutral, and which maintain good relations with everybody, China, US, Japan, India, Middle East, Europe. And I think we can do that. I think we can do that because we are completely non-threatening. Therefore, we are not a problem to anybody. And our history is always to be promiscuous and to be open to all sides. I think that would be Singapore's contribution to help build ASEAN. And ASEAN, in turn, can be a very useful platform for the major powers to meet and to hammer out agreements.
Thank you very much for this contribution and suggestion. In fact, and now I turn to Shankar.
What can India do for a global economic recovery? First, I think we need to get our economy going. And I think we can do it because ours is an economy which depends to a very great extent, more than most major economies, on domestic demand. And if we do that, we can then, because we depend on the world and we are increasingly integrated with the world, we can contribute at least to creating some growth in the global economy. 80% of our imports are actually maintenance imports, whether it's energy, whether it's non-ferrous metals, and so on. So these are things we will do with the rest of the world. We will engage economically. What can we do to reconfigure the global order? My own sense is, given all the constraints, the various relationships, China, US, etc., contention, I would say, and I say this to my Indian friends, build issue-based coalitions of the willing and deal with immediate problems, building things up from the bottom up. If your problem is, say, energy supplies flowing through maritime security in the Gulf, why is the US today having a fifth fleet there when they don't import oil anymore? Who imports oil today? It's China, Japan, India, Korea. We depend on that sea lane. So we should be providing security, keeping those sea lanes safe for the oil flows. build issue-based coalitions like that. Depending on the issue, find partners, work with them until we arrive at an international order. But I think that's still some way away. That would be my answer.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Nabil, your contribution?
Yes, two things. I mean, Egypt's economy is smaller than those of the other countries on the panel. That being said, I would continue and energize our focus on enhancing regional economies. I think we can be very helpful for African economies in particular. One, by expanding our regional infrastructural projects into Africa, and we've started both road systems and energy projects, electricity and so on. That would be helpful. I would also argue that we can be a strong voice in favor of serious debt relief for African countries as a result of COVID-19. And this is something that they are going to face rather steeply. Projections for our economy are 3%, which is achievable, I think, although it's not something that satisfies our needs. But I would truly believe that focusing more on developing regional cooperation economically would be beneficial to the world economy as a whole. In terms of the world order, everybody here is saying it's incremental, and I completely agree. Effecting that will be incremental. But I think it's very important for leaders in our different regions and sub-regions. If you want I hate to use this word, but the more entrenched, the older countries, to speak out not about the past, but about the future. We need to talk about the future. We need to encourage our people to try to define their order in their own region. The Middle East is a complete mess. To try to develop a world order where we differ and agree. Sorry, a regional order where we may differ and agree, but manage our differences and agreements like they have done in many parts of Asia would be useful. But you have to have the soft power and the depth and experience to talk about the future in a coherent fashion. And I encourage my country to do more of that. But I would close with one last point, and I'm not doing this sentimentally, but I actually remember the days where everybody listened to the non-aligned movement, whether they liked it or not, was not important, but it resonated around the world. And I actually believe that many of the countries here, they don't have to be non-aligned countries. Many of the countries here who are leaders about where the world should go. That's really what the non-aligned movement was talking about. It was talking about what we need to do together rather than who did what right or wrong in the past. And all of the countries represented here, and for that matter, others, have a stake here. And I encourage them all to speak out on that. And I say the same thing back home to my own colleagues. Thank you, Brahim.
Thank you very much, Nabil. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of the webinar. There are so many other issues that we could go on discussing. So let me thank you all again. Yoriko, Jizi, George, Shankar, Nabil, thank you very much for this extremely rich panel ideas. I think that the audience would have food for thought for some time to come. I hope that we will host you again in a webinar, but physically, face-to-face in Cairo sometime soon. Good morning, good afternoon, and good day to all of you.